Hi, everyone. Welcome to e-flux, and thank you. Thank you all for joining us with Rory Rowan, whom it is a great pleasure to host tonight as part of e-flux lecture series. Tonight's lecture is titled Beyond Colonial Futurism, or alternatively Beyond Colonial Frontierism, on, hang on a second, on Portugal's Atlantic Spaceport and the Neoliberalization of outer space. Briefly, the lecture uses the Atlantic Spaceport project in the Azores region of Portugal as a lens through which to explore the deep entanglement of colonial imaginaries and neoliberal governance in the context of European space exploration, as opposed to the perhaps more familiar setting of American final frontierism. For those who don't know him, Rory Rowan is a political geographer and cultural critic. His research spans critical and social theory, political ecology, and the environmental humanities. Currently, it focuses on the political and philosophical dimensions of the Anthropocene and the development of commercial industries in outer space. He is author, along with Claudio Minca, of the book On Schmidt and Space, published by Routledge in 2015. And he regularly contributes to academic journals and arts publications, among them e-flux Journal. From 2014 to 2017, he was lecturer in political geography at the University of Zurich, and currently he is guest lecturer in the MFA program at the Zurich University of the Arts. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Okay, many thanks. Let me know, by the way, if I'm too loud or too quiet. Shout out. Not so used to talking into a microphone. But many thanks for everyone for coming, and to Amal and Will at e-flux, particularly for inviting and for hosting me, making my experience hopefully smooth today. What I'm going to talk about, as Amal indicated, is some new research to me about Portugal's recent initiatives in the commercial space sector, and I'll contextualize that a little bit in some broader dynamics. And actually, probably about half of the talk will be like leading up to talk about Portugal, where I'll lay out the contextual field where I look at that specific case. It is an important proviso at the start that I'm not an expert in Portuguese history and politics, so apologies to anyone if I'm talking about your country and I don't know anything about it. I don't speak Portuguese, and my pronunciation will be dreadful throughout. Please correct me so that I can save myself from further embarrassment and insult in future, if you can. But given the limitations that I have in terms of language and so on, and I'll explain why I came to be interested in Portugal in the course of the talk. Most of what I'll talk about is situating what's happening in Portugal within the wider international context. And largely it's a discursive analysis. That's what I do, discourse analysis, based on these type of beautiful publications which the Portuguese government use for promotional purposes. So a lot of them are about trying to drum up investment interest and diplomatic maneuvering from the Portuguese state. So they're all published in English, and those are what I'm using as a source. Of course, I'm aware those are a very partial, embedded perspective, but those are the object of critique, let's say, the discourses that are running through those. So this is part of the interest in Portugal is part of a wider research project that I've been doing for a couple of years. On and off as I was finishing other work, so it's still quite new to me. And this is to focus on the global development of the commercial space sector, or so-called new space, and in particular the development of space mining industries. I'll talk about this in more detail. And I'm looking at this through a few different lenses, one of them being how the developments in the recent developments in the commercial space sector and the role of governments in enabling that can be looked at through the lens of neoliberalization and the types of policy changes that we are familiar with in various other domains of governance and the economy. but also looking at it in relation to the kind of economic and colonial imaginaries that frame outer space, and particularly the imagination of space futures, or what we might call space futures. So that these kind of sets of discourses that circulate between commercial, state, civil society actors in the media, financial organizations, to kind of legitimize this idea that there's going to be a great new space or commercial space future, and that they draw off and appeal to existing imaginaries, and particularly these kind of sets of colonial ideas about frontiers, gold rushes, colonization, and as well kind of a fair dose of kind of free market fundamentalism, which again I'll talk a little bit about in due course. And for me, this idea of kind of colonial futurism or colonial frontierism, which was a mistake, as Amal pointed out, but nonetheless, they're very kind of tied together. And so what I'm interested in is this relationship between how futures that are imagined futures off Earth are entangled with sets of power relations on Earth. So somehow kind of projected futures both off Earth and into the future, they're kind of entangled with colonial histories, histories of capital accumulation, and this kind of tangled net between them. And so how kind of histories are looked to legitimize the development of new commercial industries, and also how those new commercial industries and the discourses around those kind of reinforce and enhance existing kind of colonial and capitalist imaginations of outer space, but also of social relations on Earth. And I guess there's also a normative or kind of political dimension to my interest in this work, which kind of wants to kind of resist the idea that outer space becomes a kind of a new arena for capital accumulation and corporate power, resist the idea that outer space becomes kind of a renewed arena for geopolitical competition and military conflict. I'm sure many of you saw recently that Donald Trump was talking about developing a space force alongside the US Air Force. He seemed to not realize that there wasn't a space force already. He thought that was a good idea. We'll do that. We'll be doing that. Obviously, can't take too seriously what he says, but nonetheless, the idea that the idea of militarizing space is still very present in at least the US government, and resist the idea that there's kind of this this bonanza of resources in outer space that kind of can use as a kind of fix for environmental crisis on Earth. And particularly this idea, as I mentioned, that outer space discursively is another kind of arena where colonial imaginaries that legitimize racist violence and inequality on Earth just continue. And we see a lot of that in the contemporary discussions. So in some sense, myself, and I'm not alone as a political geographer or cultural geographer, looking at outer space. Generally, you're treated with a bit of kind of laughter. You're like, outer space, that's ridiculous, that's not a real space somehow. But kind of there's quite a few of us trying to work with the idea of geographies of outer space and attempt to kind of bring space back down to Earth, so to speak. That it's not just a realm of sci-fi or kind of speculative fantasy, but the processes that I'll talk about here are already real, they're already happening, and they're already entangled with our everyday. And of course, this is being live streamed, one example of how this is totally embedded in our everyday lives already. And even the kind of speculative industry of space mining, I'm pretty sure that it's never going to happen, but there's a lot of processes, technical, financial, governmental, policy, legal, that are already happening around this. Okay, so it doesn't mean that something materially has to happen in the future for this to already be real, because it's already bound up in lots of processes in the present. Another kind of desire to kind of puncture the kind of Musk mania and the kind of fixation on Musk and these other kind of supposedly charismatic billionaire CEOs. If you've ever seen Musk, he doesn't seem that charismatic. I know some people here actually might know him. I'm sure he's a nice guy and all that. But yeah, it doesn't seem like the most, the way that he's is treated and the way that people refer to him as Elon, who don't know him, is quite scary to me. And why this kind of a corporate leader who has a reputation for getting things done and setting hard deadlines, like getting to Mars by 2024, is so celebrated as kind of a worrying kind of trend for me. And I think it also distracts from questions of who or what else is invested in the development of commercial space industries, which is something I think we need to pay more attention to, and particularly what is the role of states and governments in this. And in that line, to kind of shift focus away from discussions around outer space, the total dominance of the US in these discussions. And I'm particularly interested to look to Europe and also the colonial kind of territories of Europe, like French Guiana, which is part of France, which is where the European Space Agency launches most of its rockets from, and also then the Azores, which I'll talk about, which is a part of Portugal, still part of the Portuguese state, even though it's this kind of extra territorial part of those states. And particularly the role of these kind of small European states like Luxembourg and Portugal, who we don't hear a lot about in kind of most political discussions or in the news, but are really trying to stake themselves out of position in this kind of emerging commercial space sector. But of course we can look much beyond that: Russia, Australia, India, Brazil, South Korea, Angola, Mozambique, South Africa. A lot of these states are developing not only their own space programs, but trying to get a piece of the action of this kind of commercial space sector. So what I'll talk about as I go into the talk is to kind of lay out, introduce the idea of the new space sector, this commercial space industry, detail a little bit about how I'm kind of looking at it as a neoliberalization of outer space, and then look to the recent Portuguese space initiatives, and look at those through the lens of neoliberal governance and the kind of colonial imaginaries that persist within those, within the Portuguese discourses around these schemes that are all kind of in motion now, and kind of identify some wider stakes of these, kind of this idea of kind of colonial futurism and how we might think about space exploration beyond that and how that might be contested. So although the talk is called Beyond, I don't really get to the beyond. In good critical theorist tradition, I give a critique and then leave it there. But we can talk about that in questions or the pub afterwards if people want to. So, New Space. New Space is the collective name given to this kind of emerging commercial space sector. And there's various industries involved in this: tourism, logistics, communications, Earth observation, and also the speculative idea of the space mining. And it's got a global spread. There's many countries involved in this. Not all of them, in fact, are they kind of technically and economically advanced nations in the global north. There's other actors getting involved in this, but there is a heavy focus of the development of the industry within the US for understandable reasons, not just the wealth, but the size of the sector and with NASA. There's been a heavy kind of influence of Silicon Valley and this marks out new space from other kind of areas of the commercial industries which have a history of being involved in collaboration or partnership, for example, with NASA, like Boeing and other aeronautics companies. So one of the things that marks new space out, the new industries, is the influence of Silicon Valley, particularly in their funding, at least so far as it goes thus far, but also in terms of personnel, directorships. We have Elon Musk, head of SpaceX, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, Blue Origin, and Larry Page and Eric Schmidt from Google or Alphabet in Planetary Resources, probably the most prominent space mining company there is. And they kind of take not just the funding and this kind of personnel crossover, but like an ethos. And it's a bit of a mix of kind of the kind of startup, kind of innovative, move fast and break things idea, and also the kind of global ambition of companies like Google. So you have this kind of mix of which you see a lot of in Musk, like huge amounts of investment and vast amounts of technological infrastructure, with this idea that engineering infrastructure can totally revolutionize human society, both on Earth and off, but yet having this kind of the plucky startup, I'll risk everything. People need to take risks kind of startup discourse at the same time. In terms of the financing, a lot of it so far has come from these kind of celebrity billionaire CEOs like Musk, Bezos, Page, and Schmidt. And in some sense, they're kind of can be seen as kind of vanity projects. But really, since in the last 2 or 3 years, where financing has started to kind of come in from other investors, where they've actually managed to convince people that their businesses are viable, that's where we're seeing this industry really picking up. So there's quite a lot of investment funds are starting to show interest in this, including Goldman Sachs, who made a report to their investors in 2007, last year, about the viability of space mining as a kind of a long-term return, but something that people should they advise their investors to start investing in already. And a lot of it, of course, comes from nation states in the background, including through contracts that are given. For example, from NASA, cancelled its space shuttle program and now relies on SpaceX to shuttle, and the Russian space program, to shuttle equipment to and from the International Space Station. And there's plans then for SpaceX to start shuttling American astronauts to the International Space Station and other future installations in Earth orbit. So kind of not just through these contracts, but also through the huge amounts of research and development funding and infrastructure that the state kind of provides, much like the discussions around the tech industry, where there's all this discussion that, you know, Facebook, Google, Amazon completely revolutionized the economy with their technological innovation. A lot of the times, those infrastructures, like the internet, which provide all those things to happen, were emerging from decades and decades of government research, which kind of discursively goes into the background of the way that the technology sector sees itself and is discussed in the popular media and so on. And an important organization that kind of lies in the background of this is Space Frontier Foundation. They're American-based nonprofit organization, and they actually coined the phrase New Space. And they're kind of what they call themselves a space advocacy organization. So their whole argument has been that humans need to go to outer space, need to go and colonize space so that we can escape planetary extinction on Earth, but that also space is a kind of a space of freedom. And they have this kind of very libertarian kind of ethos where democracy, they're into the democratization of space, but for them, democracy equals free markets. So they have ideas of the kind of final frontier being a kind of free market frontier. So there's kind of talk of a free market frontierism. And these people are, in some sense, absolute freaks and outliers, but they've really recently moved into kind of, through their influence on the new space industry and their relationship to governments, notably Luxembourg, have kind of moved out of the shadows and are having quite a big influence on shaping discourse and also investment patterns. So space mining, which I won't talk about so much today because Portugal is not involved in this, this is kind of, for me, the kind of key aspect of this. Obviously, it's a speculative industry for the minute. Space mining hasn't happened. It may not happen. Although, again, it's not just the private sector that's involved in this. Both NASA and the European Space Agency and the Chinese Space Agency all have programs to try and build technologies which could potentially be used for space mining or for scientific experiments, but extracting materials from things like asteroids or the moon and so on. The private sector companies are mostly focused in the US, but also in Japan and Europe. And legislation has recently been passed in the US and Luxembourg, and soon to be passed in the United Arab Emirates, to support the development of space mining sector. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So there's a lot of hype discussion in the media, particularly kind of the kind of right-wing and pro-market kind of publications like The Economist, Financial Times, about this kind of coming next gold rush, and this a lot of discussion about this kind of new frontier for resource extraction that can not only provide a kind of bonanza for a few people lucky enough to get a stake of it, but nation states, and also as a kind of ecological fix for a kind of a resource-depleted Earth. And this is kind of, these discussions around space mining are particularly kind of saturated with ideas of frontierism and kind of frontier discourses, and there's direct reference made by leading players to the settlement of the American West, not only as a kind of historical figure, but to precise pieces of legislation, where they say that the US passing legislation to allow private property recognition for materials extracted from space is similar to the kind of the Frontier Act, which opened up the American West to the spread of the United States. So kind of ideas of kind of private industry and kind of plucky individuals, these rugged frontiersmen and always men, kind of providing a kind of a beachhead for kind of state territorial processes. So a lot of the kind of discussion, even though it's about kind of free market frontiers and so on, kind of also the examples that are looked to, the historical examples, tie that very much to kind of patterns of geopolitical expansion. And which was more surprising to me, you know, we kind of expect this somewhat from, you know, the frontier as this kind of emblematic kind of figure of historical change in the US, and it saturates so much popular discourse. I was a bit more surprised to find it in the European context, where the European Space Agency make direct appeals on almost everything they say to the great European legacy of discovery and exploration. Very careful, of course, not to use the word colonization, but again, you see talks by people from the European Space Agency, and they show pictures of Portuguese ships sailing to the New World, and this is kind of how they say Europe should have a leading place rather than America in space exploration, because Europeans know what they're doing when they're exploring, as opposed to the supposedly bad Americans. You know? And this, of course, expressed itself most strongly in the kind of that SpaceX plans to colonize Mars, and Mars One, which is now collapsed, another private company, to kind of lead a kind of corporate colonization of Mars. I'm never sure if Musk's plan to colonize Mars are actually real, or whether it's kind of a part of a kind of thing to oil the wheels of SpaceX, other ventures like providing logistics support to NASA, increase their contracts with other nations to make them an exciting company that's going to colonize Mars. I mean, if he really thinks it's serious, he's a total lunatic. Maybe he's a bit more rational, and it's just kind of a discourse used to kind of develop his business. I'm not sure. So it's important to emphasize that new space, these kind of private industries that are emerging around this, again, are not just a kind of a bunch of freaks and involved in these speculative businesses, which are all kind of flights of fantasy and so on. The ones that get most talked about, like Musk and so on, tend to lean towards that side. Most new space industries are fairly kind of mundane things involving small-scale satellites, nano-satellites that used for communications and Earth observation. That's the large bulk of the industry, although space mining occupies this particularly strong kind of ideological, let's say, position within the discourse. But they're already having this effect on governance. So these companies that have emerged are already exerting sufficient pressure on governments, or they seem like a viable enough industrial area for the governments to invest in and change their governance. And the way in which that's happening is various depending on the context, but in all cases what we see are kind of states starting to restructure their activities, restructure governance around the commercial space sector, whether it's carving out areas of former public state competence to commercial actors, and here the example I already mentioned of NASA cutting the space shuttle program under Obama to make room for commercial actors such as SpaceX or Boeing are also getting contracts to provide logistical support for American involvement in the International Space Station. Or rather than kind of, here's an area of state activity, we're going to kind of, the state's going to withdraw from that and to make space for commercial actors. Rather, we have other areas where entirely new areas of governance are being developed by states to involve markets from the ground up, to kind of grow markets. And that's what you see in cases in the European states like Luxembourg and Portugal that I'll talk about, where there wasn't a pre-existing space program, a huge thing like NASA, which, bulky, typical kind of a behemoths state enterprise, which needs to be kind of pulled back in the neoliberal logic to make room for the market, where actually areas of government's space programs are set up specifically for the purpose of growing private industry, which is what we see in the more European kind of context. And the centrality of, one of the reasons that space mining is so important, regardless of whether it kind of happens or not, is that it's already started to have the biggest effect on reshaping governance of outer space. And that's particularly because it requires a regulatory framework for a private property regime to occur. It needs a private property regime for investors to feel this is a safe industry to invest in. And there was a huge amount of lobbying from private companies, including Planetary Resources with the Google CEOs and directors, and also from that Space Frontier Foundation, this kind of libertarian non-profit that I mentioned, putting pressure for in the Space Frontier Foundation's case, decades to try and change legislation to recognize private property in space, with the idea that if the state produces a legislation to recognize private property, investors will feel secure, capital will flow, money will be made, and people will enrich themselves. And in some sense, regardless of whether the bonanza of resources ever actually appears, whether space mining ever happens, already the money started to flow, which does not just go into private hands, but also that those states, for example, in the United States, like Florida, which have large space sector and infrastructure to spread and develop the commercial space industry, are very interested, and they tend to have strong leaning towards Republican Congress people to try and kind of push the government to produce legislation to let the capital flow. And the first piece of legislation of this, the first state to act in this way, was the United States. Under Obama, signed the Space Act in November 2015, which was the first piece of legislation to recognize private property in outer space. And it recognizes private property of extracted from celestial bodies, so the moon, planets, asteroids, comets, anything that's beyond the Earth's orbit, which incidentally, there is no consensus either scientifically or in legislation of where the Earth's orbit is, where the Earth ends and where space starts. That's a kind of there's various different ideas about where that is. So this also produces kind of legal technicalities about, well, what's legal where. Anyway, that's an aside. But so the US Space Act recognizes the right of private organizations, private companies, but those have to be, in this legislation, US-based companies led by US citizens. So they have to be directed by US citizens, which is also a peculiar piece of legislation. Luxembourg launched their initiative, which is probably the first, I think, I would say state ministry. It's not good. It's not a full ministry. It's what they call an initiative, a state initiative. And the name of the department, if you imagine it's like the Ministry of Space Resources, the name is a website. So it's actually called spaceresources.lu, which I think must be like a kind of innovation in kind of the naming of government departments to name it a website. Anyway, this Luxembourg initiative, they passed legislation through their parliament last year in July 2007, again recognizing the right of private companies who extract materials in outer space as private property of those companies. But Luxembourg, being the crafty little state that it is, had one up in the US by saying, well, you don't have to be US citizens, you don't have to be Luxembourg citizens, Luxembourg companies, you just have to register yourself here. It doesn't even have to be your head office. So suddenly they have a huge rush of companies, including the leading companies of space mining in the US who move, if not their head offices, they open an office in Luxembourg. And they further, unlike the US, provided financial incentives by releasing 200 billion euros worth of funding for partnerships with companies, investment in research and development, startup funding, seed funding, and so on. And both of these pieces of legislation, it's important to note, are in contradiction with the existing international legal agreements of which all spacefaring nations and Luxembourg are a signatory. So basically, they both say that they're in keeping with international law, which is the Outer Space Treaty, largely the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, of which the appropriation of materials is in outer space is outlawed explicitly. There's some ambiguity about whether that includes by private actors or not. So there's lots of kind of space law experts arguing about this, but the consensus is that it is not legal under international law what the US and Luxembourg have passed in their domestic legislation. The US basically says, we don't give a fuck what anyone else thinks, as always, we're going to pass our law, and until time this becomes reality, we'll go with that. Luxembourg are in basically a massive campaign at the minute to go around trying to drum up international consensus that this should happen through a consensus model. So they've signed a memoranda of agreement with all these other states, including Japan, India, China, lots of Ireland, I think, as well, strangely, where I'm from. Lots of small states. They're basically in the background trying to build up this consensus that there should be an international agreement to allow a private property regime in outer space. I spoke with one of the lawyers recently at a conference, and she was very keen to assure me after I'd criticized the Luxembourg program that they were not the big bad guys like the US. And the US, oh, they're terrible, they do everything just unilaterally, idiots, and this is not the right way to go, but we're doing it. We're trying to build a consensus to make it all good. Kind of missing the point that it wasn't necessarily that there was a lack of consensus around it that is also bad in itself. But so it remains to be seen as to what happens with this this private property legislation, but what the effect has already been is to release all this kind of capital flows. Investors are now making this a kind of a mini boom of a speculation on future space mining, and we're looking at like 3 decades as the closest estimation of when that might actually start to happen. So this is unusually long-term investments. You know, usually the exit strategy for companies is 5 years. So what I've kind of I'm writing or about to publish a paper on what I've called the new space state, the kind of the petro state, where you have an industrial area which starts to restructure governance around it, and particularly a kind of an area of extractive industry, restructuring governance around it, state power, reordering itself around this extractive industry. We're starting to see that in the case of Luxembourg and the US. Of course, unlike petrostates, space mining doesn't become this kind of total force which restructures every aspect of state power as, for example, oil in Nigeria or something like this. but nonetheless, there's kind of tangible effects that are already happening within the structure of state power through these kind of developments. So my interest in all this kind of brought me last year to go to the first New Space Europe conference, and the New Space US conference, or they just call it New Space Conference because it's from America originally, is organized and hosted by the Space Frontier Foundation, this kind of libertarian space advocacy group that I mentioned. And its purpose has been to provide a kind of forum and a platform for particularly private companies, also investors, corporate lawyers, representatives of Congress in the US to meet and kind of push and produce more kind of coherence around the private space industry and produce kind of the appearance of public support for the development of private property regimes in space. So that's been the kind of the agenda of the New Space Conference. So the first one happened last year in Europe to kind of announce the development of the new space sector within Europe, and this was hosted by Luxembourg in kind of collaboration with the Space Frontier Foundation. I'd never been to Luxembourg before. It's a really creepy place, and this was a particularly creepy kind of conference to go to. Again, it's full of, I've only ever been to academic conferences before, and this was way more exciting with lots of like established space companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, lots of startups, investors, corporate lawyers, and so on, and representatives of states and the European Space Agency, all kind of pitching to each other and to a very small number of the public, mostly journalists other than myself, who were there to kind of startups trying to get investors, investors looking for startups to invest in, and everyone's giving basically a 5 to 8 minute TED Talk style promotion, self-promotion. And I mean, the styles of the presentation are amazing. There was one Austrian guy who was called to the stage, and then he didn't appear. And the person was like, "Oh, he's late. Is he here? Is he not here?" And then he bounded into the room with like a Madonna-style microphone and was like, "Yes, I was just making deals. I was so busy. I didn't have time to get on stage on time. Apologies, everyone." And at the end, he ran off stage again, like a kind of Schwarzenegger 1985 style of a. So all that kind of stuff is very entertaining, but also very troubling what people are actually kind of saying. But no, interesting, there was, even though the whole thing was to celebrate the passing of the legislation in Luxembourg around space mining legislation, there was very, very little mention of space mining. Most of the startups were, as I mentioned before, they're kind of small satellite companies trying to put clusters of tiny little satellites, nanosatellites to use in various ways. So that was slightly deflating for me to realize that space mining is not really important to the people in the new space sector, but it's very important to the states and the investors. But who I was surprised to see there was the Portuguese state, who sent their Minister of Science, Technology and Higher Education, I have no idea how to pronounce his surname, I'm sorry, Manuel Heitor, it looks like, who gave a very interesting and peculiar talk. I didn't know that Portugal was involved in this sector, and they in fact had just decided to be and launched this kind of new program, which I'll talk about. But he was there to pitch Portugal as a desirable location for investment, particularly from investment funds and from the European Space Agency, to invest in their new space initiatives, their kind of ventures into the commercial space sector. And he kind of sketched out a very ambitious plan from the Portuguese government to develop this space sector, but also more interestingly, perhaps to me, was how he tried to argue that the growth of the commercial space sector in Portugal would kind of confirm Portugal's leading position in the world and also kind of alter it, and in some sense return Portugal to its kind of former glory as a kind of key player on the world stage, particularly in the Atlantic. And Portugal, needless to say, is probably not the usual suspect when it comes to thinking about outer space or outer space industries. And for me, that's kind of precisely why it's interesting that this kind of small state that's gone recently has been traditionally extremely one of the very poor states in Europe, particularly in Western Europe, and had recently gone through a massive financial crisis over the last decade with huge amounts of austerity programs and the state cutting back on social services and so on. And which is currently kind of desperate to try and find foreign direct investment, particularly in relationship to their kind of former colonies. So they have this kind of golden visa program, where if you're a rich Brazilian and you invest €500,000 upward in real estate in Portugal, you get a permanent residency permit, so you can conduct business there. Not a citizenship, but a right to be there and to conduct business. I don't know if it's been successful, but certainly some people have done it. And also the kind of a drive to try and attract investment from rich Angolans. Angola had a kind of a oil boom over the last 20 years since the civil wars ended. And even though the oil boom in Angola has totally collapsed and the economy has gone to the shit, unsurprisingly, some people made a lot of money out of that, a very small number of people, many of whom are kind of living between Luanda and Lisbon, and there's a kind of a policy to try and attract investment from these rich Angolans. So in some sense, this kind of space program which they're launching now is fits amongst a number of other attempts to try and draw wealth, foreign direct investment as a way to generate economy, but also this kind of relationship with its former colonies. And interesting to me because in the work I've done so far, I've kind of made a central place of extraction or space mining within the kind of broader neoliberalization of space, or let's say the effects that the commercial space sector has had on government or governance. And interesting about Portugal, they make no mention of space mining. They're not interested in that. They're not suggesting that they get involved in that. But what they are interested in is all these other aspects that come with new space. So it kind of is not just a kind of outlier in the space sector as a whole, but it's also a bit of an outlier. It's doing something different with regard to how it's kind of neoliberalizing or how it's trying to kind of enter into this new space market. And I particularly like the discourse that kind of flows through this document, which is I'll talk about in a second, and all these campaigns, tries to draw on the specific history and geography of Portugal, particularly its colonial and imperial histories and geographies, as a way to argue that Portugal has particular things to offer to the new space investors. And it also couches it in very different terms than you find in Luxembourg and the US, where a huge emphasis is put on simply business development, to kind of a weird tension between saying, invest in space mining, we've produced legislation for you to invest in space mining, make a quick buck in 35 years. So it's kind of this weird, strange idea of kind of making it instantaneous. We want your money, invest in this, it's really exciting, but it's going to take 30 or 50 years before you get anything back, but it's going to be huge. Their discourse is almost entirely based around promoting business. As I mentioned, in Luxembourg, trying to kind of build a kind of a governance consensus around this kind of new business sector. But in the Portuguese case, they put an emphasis on socioeconomic development and international cooperation, particularly with what they call North-South, South-North. And every time they mention the relationship between the global North and the global South, they have this kind of pairing of North-South, South-North to emphasize how they're kind of reaching out from Europe or the global North towards those in the global South. And again, claiming that they have a kind of traditional, through their colonial and imperial history and geography, that Portugal has a kind of privileged position as this kind of a bridge or translator between the global North and the global South. So their version of new space is to say that the Portuguese state wants to get a piece of the action of this new commercial space industry, come and invest here, and that'll be good because it'll be kind of socially and environmentally conscious form of new space. So they talk about even ecologically sustainable rocket launches, things like this. If you know anything about rocket launches, they're not really very ecologically sustainable. So they're kind of playing the kind of partly because they lack the funds to make rocket launches, but also to kind of play that Portugal is this kind of a good state. They're going to give the good version of new space, and it's going to be socially conscious and be good for not only Portugal, but also good for the global South. It'll have this kind of developmental aspect to it. So the key of this initiative is this, they call it a space program. Not quite sure if that's the right word for it, but it's called Portugal Space 2030. So the idea is that in the next decade and a bit, 12 years, that Portugal will grow its space program into a fully fledged true space agency and become a kind of European leader in the forefront of the commercial space sector, and declares itself a space nation, now kind of positioning itself alongside those kind of traditional great powers with huge amounts of finance and technological weight, like America, Russia, China, India, Britain, France, and so on, Germany, to have its own space program. It calls it a research, innovation, and growth strategy aligned with Portugal's geographic location and its scientific and entrepreneurial ecosystems. And this, actually going to this New Space conference in Luxembourg, I discovered that ecosystem is the new business term, which seems to mean everything. Everyone's always talking about entrepreneurial ecosystems. It's a key part of the European Space Agency's discourse as well, is to promote business and public-private, not partnerships, but ecosystems. So it's designed to create a new generation of young Portuguese engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs, and aims to build a legal, financial, institutional, international, and cultural framework that boosts the development of the space sector in Portugal, making itself a research and innovation hub in partnership with new space industries. And crucially, here there's kind of like this quite kind of lot of discourse of kind of coming from a kind of EU kind of technocratic style, but it also seems they've had like a British PR company go through it, and it's this very kind of generic economic boosterism that goes through it, almost kind of a bit meaningless in a way. But crucially, they say that this will also give them a kind of stake a claim to Atlantic leadership, and again, this idea that it's been a tradition of Portugal, the Portuguese state, to show leadership in the Atlantic, including, of course, colonization and their imperial trade in slaves and commodities, but that this is kind of something that through new space that they will kind of reclaim and make their own, because they have experience in it. It's a safe pair of hands for developing kind of Atlantic interactions, as they call it. And a lot of the funding from this comes, yes, from the Portuguese state, but also from the European Space Agency, which is a intergovernmental agency, which is separate from the EU. It has 22 member states. And it's a very important kind of driver of the neoliberal space agenda within Europe, particularly through the kind of funding campaigns it has, but also kind of promoting the development of small states like Luxembourg and Portugal, trying to get them to get involved in the commercial space sector. And again, these ideas of entrepreneurial ecosystems seem to come directly from the European Space Agency, or at least the Portuguese state are trying to appeal to the European Space Agency by replicating their language to get them to support them. So there's all this talk about, this is a European Space Agency brochure that was distributed at this conference I was at, to talk about how successful their investment has been in producing Portuguese startup, and it details all the Portuguese startups in the space sector, but also kind of has this talk of technology transfer brokers, business application ambassadors, business incubation centers, and lists off the data of how much money has been invested in different countries and the return on their euro, and all the startups that have emerged. I don't know if any of them still exist, but they talk about the 130 new startups that start annually. Most of them, I'm sure, collapse pretty soon. And so that they kind of produce this for the Portuguese state, which then distributes it in conjunction with its own kind of promotional materials to show that Portugal is as tied into the European Space Agency, to kind of again give more confidence to investors that they've got this the big kind of power of this international or intergovernmental agency behind it. And Portugal has its own Lisbon-based European Space Agency Business Incubation Centre. The guy at the conference who was from the European Space Agency and head of the Business Incubation Centre, he had a polo shirt on saying, "I need more space." And when he was talking to anyone, regardless of who he was, he stood with his legs directly apart like this with his hands on his hips. I took some photographs of him. They're a bit too shitty quality to show you, but he was kind of hilarious. I was thinking in German, he was German, I was thinking it would be Lebensraum, would it? In German, would be a kind of funny thing to have on his shirt. Anyway, so Portugal has its European Space Agency Business Incubation Centre, which has apparently created 30 companies already. They've invested almost 2 million euros of investment into startups and in helping companies develop themselves for the stock to go public, or to develop international, what do you call it, IP? What's the word? Intellectual property. I couldn't word the word intellectual, oddly enough. Intellectual property development, which they give these little packages of $50,000. And the guy had on his PowerPoint, he had all these packets of euros being kind of thrown on the screen towards like bonanza to everyone, as if he was like the European Space Agency distributing money or bribes or something. And so Portugal has used this money to set up this air research center. And this is, again, to talk about how they're engaging in the new space, the commercial space sector. They couch that within this broader, let's say the linchpin, the keynote of this Portugal Space 2030 plan is this Air Research Centre, which stands for Atlantic Interactions Research Centre. This was launched last summer, again, just before the conference I was at. And it's to be an intergovernmental research centre in the Azores being Mid-Atlantic Archipelago, which is an autonomous region of Portugal. So a little bit like French Guiana for the French, it's actually part of the Portuguese state, even though it's still it's an island in the middle of it, a set of islands, 9 of them, in the middle of the Atlantic. And this kind of research centre is actually to focus on climate change, oddly enough, from deep sea to space, as they say, joining together kind of space, ocean, and atmospheric sciences to face societal challenges that affect the future of humanity. And for them, they try and position space research as key, obviously through Earth observation, satellites, and so on. Space is a kind of key to generating knowledge about societal challenges that come from climate change and the future of humanity on Earth. And to say that also they'll work with, they collaborate with scientists, institutions, universities, states, and companies in the global south, Nigeria, Angola, South Africa, Brazil, as well as USA and Canada, and they have partnerships with US and Canadian universities to promote this kind of north-south, south-north scientific collaboration. So this Air Research Centre becomes a kind of an international research centre to promote cooperation, diplomatic cooperation, and socio-economic development between the global north and global south, at the core of which research into outer space will be. So this is, as again, to say it's meant to be basically a climate change research, which joins all these different types of research relevant to climate change together. But then in the middle of this air centre, they want to develop the Atlantic Spaceport. So the Atlantic Spaceport, of which this is one of there's no images of it yet, hasn't been built. They're going at the minute through feasibility reports, which are being done by the University of Texas, Austin, to see whether it's plausible to build this. But this would be a commercial launch site, so a kind of infrastructure site for commercial rocket launches into space, not for state launches, not from the European Space Agency or NASA or any other national space agency, but for commercial private companies who want to launch satellites for whatever use. That would be the purpose of this. There are some of these that exist already. They haven't been in the US. They haven't been a great success. So whether as an investment opportunity, I'm not sure it's very viable anyway. But regardless, they talk about this as being a kind of how Portugal will be this kind of innovator in new space. But the irony of locating a kind of commercial rocket launch site in the middle of an international research venture into climate change, of which is meant to show Portugal as this kind of a bridge nation between the underdeveloped global south and the developed global north, is quite amazing. And so for them, and right through all these documents, they will kind of weave this very nice kind of talk, a kind of liberal internationalist talk about socio-economic development across the north-south and so on, and partnerships with developing nations in the global south. They'll weave into that the centrality of new space, and so their attempt to attract commercial space funding for the commercial space industry. So they make new space core to scientific research on climate change and the future of humanity. New space is core to cooperation between the global north and the global south. New space is core to Portugal's Atlantic leadership. And in some sense, you see this map, which comes with the Air Centre and the Atlantic Spaceport. You see this kind of net, which of interactions, Atlantic interactions, which Portugal says that it doesn't center itself in it, but it's one of the nodes within this network. But actually, in all the discourse, it sees itself and promotes itself as the center of this kind of this cross-Atlantic net that cross east-west, north-south, and so on. And it positions itself as a kind of a global leader, or as the minister said in Luxembourg, a new positioning of Portugal in the world, which somehow, again, links back to this traditional or historical, let's say, position of Atlantic dominance, which Portugal had many centuries ago through its colonization and the slave and commodities trade across the Atlantic, which has been lost for centuries, it now gets to reclaim and refashion itself for the 21st century via the commercial space industry. And so I want to just read this little sentence, which again comes from this document showing how kind of Portugal positions itself in regard to new space and the Atlantic and its kind of geopolitical position in the world. So I quote, "Due to its history, Portugal has strong links with developing countries in different continents. This provides the grounds for active international cooperation with a view of developing capabilities in the space domain and domains that may benefit from space-based and space-enabled services and applications." So you can kind of see this quite like technocratic EU-type discourse, but again, Portugal making an appeal to its traditional strong links to developing countries, i.e. colonialism on different continents, i.e. empire, as a kind of grounds to position itself as the kind of liberal connector between global north and global south. And these maps that they distribute are quite similar to lots of maps that were produced during both the Salazar regime, the fascist dictatorship, from the 1920s to 1970s, and then after Salazar regime had been deposed in a coup, and there was a democratic revolution in Portugal, there was an attempt to again recast these kind of maps which show Portugal in this, not in a position of dominance, but somehow as this kind of a connector between global north and global south, a connector between continents of Africa, Latin America, and Europe, and saying that Portugal, even though it's small, it's poor at the edge of Europe, has this key role as a kind of a bridge country. And for me, this is kind of a way to think about how, not in the more familiar terrain of kind of the context of the US space program and all this talk of final frontierism, and in the new space version it's free market frontierism, but another version of this kind of colonial futurism where colonial history and geographies are kind of drawn on or recast to kind of imagine kind of futures in space. And in the case of Portugal, trying to leverage its colonial history as to carve out a space or place in the future of a commercial space industry. There's this intimate connection which they draw between the colonial histories and geographies of Portugal's empire and space futures, and drawing in its kind of colonial territories and the key position that the Azores provides for research in the Atlantic as this kind of node. And again, they talk about the Azores always as being they talk about Portuguese territory so that they can include the Azores as a way to kind of expand Portugal into the Atlantic, into this this connecting position. How am I doing for time? It's good? Okay. Yeah, so again, looking at the kind of history of how Portugal has imagined itself, or the state has imagined itself and represented these kind of bridging functions between global north and global south. There was a lot of discussion in the 1960s of this kind of lusotropical mythos, where Portugal was this kind of imperial mixer of Atlantic cultures, different from the bad empires of France and Britain, who had kind of racist hierarchies. Theirs was supposed to be a kind of an imperialism of mixing, and so a very kind of sexualized idea of colonial relations, where, oh, you know, we all fucked and had children together, so it was all fine, and there wasn't really hierarchies, which was a kind of importing of the kind of the myth of kind of the Brazilian kind of nation as this kind of pluriracial mixed new nation without hierarchies, which has been independent of Portugal since the 1820s, importing that back into 20th century Portuguese self-understandings, particularly after the democratic revolution in 1976. This became actually quite an important kind of figure of how Portugal tried to rethink itself after it had lost its colonies, as kind of a way to maintain the relationships to its kind of now post-colonial countries, its long history of relationships with now cast as developing countries. So this is kind of another version of quite typical ways in which the Portuguese state produces images that tries to inflate the power of Portugal on the world stage, and using the Atlantic as this kind of place of exchange where Portugal, via the Azores, has a key position as a kind of transistor almost in the kind of a communication and development of the Atlantic. So what does this tell us then, or why is this, the case of Portugal, kind of interesting? So in one sense, to me, it shows the way in which the centrality of neoliberalism, or neoliberalization of the outer space sector, is not purely a phenomena connected to the United States, and it's not purely a phenomena connected to space mining, as the case of the Luxembourg, but it actually is a kind of set of, let's say, driven by the European Space Agency, but is kind of taken up in specific ways, in specific cases where different states and different national contexts have a set of kind of repertoires and cultural imaginaries and geographic imaginaries that they draw on to claim their space within this kind of neoliberalization of outer space. And also the centrality of colonial imaginaries within the European space sector. This is something which, like, social scientists and humanities scholars, cultural studies scholars, have made decades of work critiquing the kind of colonial imaginaries that are core to the American space cultures or astrocultures of the kind of final frontiers and so on. But this is very much unremarked upon in the context of Europe. And again, Europe and European, let's say, international institutions traditionally positioning themselves over recent decades as the kind of the good player compared to the US unilateralism, and particularly since the Iraq and Afghanistan, or the Iraq War over recent decades, Europe as being this kind of idea of the European Union, the European Space Agency being connected to multilateralism, to peace, to social economic development, and so on. But actually, in this kind of context, you see the persistence of the colonial imaginaries, and again, the centrality of Portugal within that, not only for the Portuguese, but also for the European Space Agency, who traditionally roll out pictures of Henry the Navigator when they're talking about the history of and the legacy of European exploration. So if this kind of shows that there's a more kind of plural version of the colonial futurisms or colonial frontierisms, works well enough, in the kind of in contemporary discussions about the colonization of outer space or development of commercial space sectors. What can we say about that, or how do we respond to that? And it prompts the question is if there's another model of thinking about space exploration, another way of imagining or practicing, let's say, relationships towards outer space. Is it possible to kind of decouple, so to speak, space exploration, space programs from the kind of neoliberal state governance and the kind of colonial imaginaries in which it is embedded, not only in the United States, but also now we see in European contexts? And I think in some sense, what is starting to emerge is that outer space, this site which is considered by many people being not a site of relevant to social or political concerns, never mind the economies, but is deeply embedded within those, it becomes a kind of potential site of contestation or kind of a, say, cultural political struggle between different visions or possible visions of how we imagine space should be used, what the relationship and activities in space should be, and how we imagine the role of space exploration in the future of societies here on Earth. And I think there's various kind of pathways to which you could think as to how the existing conversations in these kind of colonial capitalist imaginaries might be contested. And one of them, in fact, which is not something I always initially reach to, is existing international legal agreements, which in the Outer Space Treaty signed in 1967 at the height of the Cold War, which was aimed to kind of prevent the militarization of space or conflict either in or from space between the US and Russia at that time, the Soviet Union, was actually a surprisingly radical document in the sense that it established outer space as the common heritage of all mankind, which, unfortunate gendered language of the time, but nonetheless establishing outer space as a kind of public good, not just of any one state or of states, but of all people. This is kind of quite almost like a radical slip that was made by in the attempt to reach an agreement to prevent kind of arming of outer space. And so already within the international agreements, you have this idea that space is a commons held by no one but for all, and that space is a kind of a public good. And so a lot of the appeals that are made, including by the Portuguese state, that the commercial space sector actually makes space a public good and democratizes outer space. That vision of democratizing outer space is to marketize outer space. But within the international, the Outer Space Treaty, already there's a kind of a vision of democratizing outer space in a way which does not marketize it, but in fact prevents its marketization, prevents its appropriation for private property, and prevents the expansion of capital accumulation into outer space, and kind of keeps it from that, even if that was not the intention of those who signed the agreement. That's kind of embedded in the law. So there's some kind of leverage from this existing legal agreement. The Moon Treaty, which I've put up here, is a kind of a failed treaty. It only managed to get 4 nations, most of them quite small. Well, one of them is India, but others are quite small, not very influential states on the world stage. Was kind of a treaty which tried to put some kind of teeth and detail on the Outer Space Treaty, or its more radical points, and it was specifically opposed the commodification of outer space and tried to establish international regulation of outer space as an environment, to recognize it as a kind of an ecological system, or a set of ecological systems that deserves to be protected, like waterways, oceans, and so on. So in some sense, these are one avenue to go through the existing kind of international agreements, or to try and revive those that are moribund, to prevent the extension of capital accumulation, but also at the level of these kind of cultural and geographic imaginaries of the colonial discourse that saturate these contemporary discussions, both from the state and commercial actors. There's various historic ways of looking at kind of cultivating alternate astrocultures, or as some call it, or alternative imaginaries of outer space and the relationship of outer space to life on Earth, that go beyond or explicitly critique space as outer space as a space which allows the development of patterns of capitalist accumulation and colonial appropriation of lands and resources. And particularly here, this poster on the left is a Black Panther poster from 1970, I think it is from, showing this kind of idea of a suspicion of a Whitey and the Moon. You know, that's another outer space being just another kind of arena in which appropriation, exploitation can go forward, but also kind of imagining other futures in outer space which are not tied to the kind of colonial imaginary of European, American models, and contemporary discussions around Afrofuturism, indigenous futurism, so and so on, provide interesting pathways to kind of think about this, that kind of go beyond the neoliberalization of outer space and these colonial imaginaries, without rejecting outer space or space exploration as a somehow inherently tainted arena which can't be gone near, to try and kind of commoning of outer space in another way, as let's say a cultural commoning of outer space, and somehow to claim it back. And there's various groups in Europe at the minute, they may exist in other places, I'm not sure, but certainly in Europe, of kind of autonomous movement-inspired groups who launch small satellites, arguably not a very good thing to do, producing more space debris, but also involved in trying to produce kind of cultural imaginaries of outer space and promote those, provide platforms for those interested in imagining other futures, both within kind of science fiction frames, but also beyond that, to kind of gather and kind of produce some kind of community around that, which seem to be, in some sense, like many ventures in the arts, kind of very, not very politically effective and so on, but I think at this early stage of the development of the commercial space sector, producing kind of cultural imaginaries and that circulate and stand against the kind of a celebration of Elon Musk and colonizing Mars and space mining and so on is an important and a valuable thing to do. And hopefully I can contribute in some minor way to that. But that's me. Thanks. If anyone's got questions.
Thank you. How long are you in town for?
I leave on Friday, but I can use this opportunity to promote another event tomorrow in the New School, the Center of Transformative Media, with Ed Keller, called Post-Planetary Futures, which is a kind of a redux, a very last-minute redux of an event 4 years ago. So if you want more of that type of stuff from me and other people, there's that tomorrow between 2 and 6. Awesome. I don't know the room.
Yeah, I can't do the pub thing tonight, but I'll be there. Maybe I can buy you lunch before that. So I'm really curious. So, okay, if you're talking about like standing against Musk and colonizing, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost like it's a large critique of capitalism. Mm-hmm. So what are the alternative ways that we're going to keep, building and expanding, and or is that not a desirable thing, or kind of what are you offering outside of a critique?
Well, I'm not really interested in I don't know what it means to be like continue building. I don't really think that there's I don't buy the idea that I mean, I'm not sure if this is what you're getting at, but it certainly circulates in these discourses that, from Musk and many other people, that if humans don't leave the planet and expand and become a multi-planet species, that we're doomed to extinction and so on. I don't really buy that. I think it's in some sense a kind of distraction from trying to have more effective ways of building, let's say, on Earth, so that there can be survivable ways of living here. I'm not interested in going to other planets or going into orbit or anything like that. But I do think, on the other hand, that space exploration is a very valuable thing. I mean, including through the science, including of Earth observation science. This not totally relies, but is a core part of Earth science. It relies on satellites and so on. And so, launching satellites is itself extremely environmentally destructive, although it's become a lot less energy intensive than it used to be. Most of the launch sites that exist, and the footprint of these is enormous, and just in land use alone. A lot of the lands are, have been lands that have been appropriated from local communities of various sorts in different parts of the world. For example, the European Space Agency has its launch sites in French Guiana and Latin America. And there's a lot of land disputes around that, for example, in Australia as well. And those things are historic at this point, but I wouldn't encourage continuing building more launch sites for the purposes of accruing private profit. There's plenty of launch sites already that could be used to launch satellites that have various uses. I'm not against satellites, but there certainly needs to be a question of why you're launching the satellite, what damage it'll do, how that might be, let's say, assessed, the value of that damage against the value you might get from the satellite data and so on. But I don't really buy the idea that we should build in space. I don't see why that should happen. I mean, I know there's arguments for it, but I don't find them convincing. So, not really manned space flight and so on. I mean, people say it's inspiring. I don't know.
Thank you.
There's a question at the front also, at the back.
I just have also a question about environmental impact, because let's say when Portuguese build that facility in Azores, right? I mean, Azores have like a very unique ecosystem. Yeah. And like you said, I mean, building a space launch facility creates a huge footprint. Mm-hmm. And what about also like, like the, let's say, burned out stages, right? I mean, where they gonna fall? Because Africa is nearby. Or I mean, like, what about the issue of like space junk also, like after launches? Because it creates a lot of hazard for areas around the space facility. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this becomes a big problem. It's the idea of space junk, that there's, all the stuff that we launch into space, particularly when rockets launch to carry satellites, then they leave the lower stages of the rockets because they're dead weight at that point. They've spent their fuel and they're the most of the weight of anything that's launched. And those circulate around in Earth orbit, often very, very small fragments, and then those can damage other satellites, which has already happened in the past. And as space gets increasingly busy with more and more traffic, there's more and more space junk. In some sense, this seems to put, like many aspects of kind of socio-technological kind of developmental plans or visions, the kind of waste product of those generated by the development of those kind of visions or programs and so on, eventually starts to undercut their possible continuity. And I think that's, I mean, what we see at some level at a planetary scale. And I think this is, you see in space junk, it's the waste that's not accounted for which starts to come back and bite space exploration on the ass. But for continuing even to do research on Earth science, this becomes this is a real problem. And so there's a shift now, particularly within the new space sector, towards nano satellites. So no longer launching these big, bulky, heavy satellites, which use a huge amount of fuel and energy and land cover to launch them, into these much smaller things. Maybe you launch 20 or 200, and they kind of circulate in a cluster, and they allegedly will, or supposedly, will provide a lot more precise information and so on. But the problem with them, of course, is that they're small and they can become junk much more easily. So let's say the attempt to make satellite launches less energy intensive and more, therefore, environmentally friendly, so to speak, by having nano satellites produces a problem in space, which may damage bigger satellites, which are core. And I think with the Azores, so that they conducted this feasibility study with the University of Austin, Texas, but also the Azores administration is very much in favor of this. The government, the autonomous government of Azores, are very much in favor of it. I don't know if they've done public consultation or not. I haven't found that out with the population as to how they feel about having a launch site. And there's also 9 islands, not all of which are very populated. I actually also can't find out which of the islands it is they plan to build it. But it's also part of a plan. So this air research center, also part of that is to show the huge exclusive economic zone, the maritime territorial waters around the edge of a state. So Portugal has a massive oceanic economic exclusive zone, not just off the coast of Portugal, because of the Azores archipelago, which are spread across quite a few hundreds of miles in the ocean. So there's plans now to develop deep sea mining. And this is also mentioned as part of the benefits of this air research center will be this great oceanic atmospheric climate research, which will help future challenges to humanity, but also we'll have a massive fucking rocket launcher and we'll use deep sea mining. It'll create opportunities for deep sea mining. And that money from that will be, fueled into further research on climate change. It seems you almost wonder, is the whole research center put there as a kind of subterfuge to allow the extractive activities? And I think unlike space mining, deep sea mining is very likely to happen in the very near future, including off the Azores and also Papua New Guinea by the same Canadian mining company, Nautilus, of which I don't know if Mariana de Silva is here, but there's people working at e-flux who are much more expert in this than me and are very involved in producing kind of public knowledge about this, both in Portugal and here, and also activist activities against it.
Thank you.
There was a question at the front also.
Oh yeah, it was just to quickly follow up on something you said earlier. Just a quick question about something you said earlier. Do you think there are any anti-colonial or anti-frontierist ways to explore space, or is the anti-colonial answer to stay on Earth?
Yeah, again, I think in bit of reference, a great question. Something I think about a lot. I think probably others are better positioned to answer than me, but I think a little bit like what I said to the first question. I don't think there's an anti-colonial way to colonize a space. There's other things you can do with a space. There's other ways you can be present or interact or relate to a space, but I don't think you can anti-colonially colonize a space. So I'm against space colonization, but I'm not against space exploration. Now you might say, okay, well, what's the line between if you send a Mars rover to Mars for scientific research and you rocket blasts into the planet, and there's teens of them up there at this point. Obviously, it has an effect on that space. It produces environmental change. Whether you consider damage or not is another factor, but it certainly produces environmental change. So let's say humans have already affected the environment of the Mars, Moon, and various moons of other planets in the solar system, and there's bits of metal and wiring also now beyond our solar system rattling away there. So whether you consider that damage or colonization, I think is also partly partly a matter of thinking about the material processes involved, but also partly thinking about how you imagine it. So I think part of the what I would consider, as you said, like is the anti-colonial position to stay on Earth? I think it depends on what you mean by also staying on Earth. You know, does that mean not sending people who do certain things? And so I think it's a matter of not doing certain things other places. But I don't think it necessarily has to mean that no more people should ever go into space. I don't know if I would have this. I've thought about it, but I can't think of an answer. But I think partly what I mean at the end is like developing alternative cultural imaginaries, is trying to have other ways of think about our relationship to space. Not only what we do there, but also how we think about it, which will guide and shape the types of things that are done, or the types of projects that manage to get support from the public, or people. Thanks.
Thank you for your talk.
Thanks. It's nepotism.
I don't think I realized before how much Portugal relied on this image of themselves as like a key broker in the transatlantic slave trade, and like that graphic that you had with all those kind of like trade routes. What is that supposed to, like, what's the cargo, like what does this graphic represent? And then in these kind of conversations, what sort of labor is imagined for like this kind of like mining or extraction industry?
Well, so this, sorry, maybe I wasn't clear. This is a contemporary map produced as part of the Air Research Center. So this is one of the maps distributed. And these are not meant to be trade routes, although it's
But
hard
I mean,
to...
it's like, are they trolling us? Like, that's exactly what
That's
it
what they
looks
look like, yeah. I mean, it's remarkable that they don't see that.
But do they not? Like, that's the question.
But so these are meant to be interactions of scientific and diplomatic cooperation between different states. And the way it's framed, as I was saying, is to be for socio-ecological development, socio-economic development, both for Portugal and for the global south particularly. And these are kind of meant to like map out these major interactive paths and show, this is almost like the geopolitical footprint of Portugal, which is, everyone thinks it's insignificant, but look how important we are. We're this force of integration across north, south, east, west. They're not, they don't say anything about space mining. I mean, it's possible that these commercial rocket launches could be involved in space mining. They don't mention about this, so that they're not invested in outer space extraction, let's say, but what they are invested in, let's say, you could say another form of extraction of trying to mine public money, both through Portuguese taxpayers and taxpayers contributing to the European Space Agency, who provide a lot of the funding, to kind of use those public funds to produce infrastructure to develop private business or provide opportunities for private capital accumulation. So therefore they're taking money from the public to invest in their industry so they can generate private property. I mean, this is a form of extraction in another sense. But so I don't know how they don't see it. I mean, the guy was the minister for science, technology and higher education. He was very kind of eloquent, but he also had this slight feel of like he didn't really believe what he was saying. He was noticeably more scruffy than all the other speakers, which I kind of liked about him. He had unshaven, just kind of like slightly looked like he'd smoked outside, and he didn't seem very highly invested in what he was saying. But that's his job, so he has to go on. And in some sense, the whole discourse feels a bit false. It's this national boosterism, but nonetheless, they're presenting these types of images, which fit into, these would be like if kids went to school in Portugal, I don't know, maybe we have some Portuguese people here that can say, or these maps that were produced either in the colonial period or in the kind of, the Salazar period, or the kind of post-colonial period of kind of the importance of the connection, Portugal's role in connecting the Atlantic world. These are familiar with very many of these maps that were produced in school books, public displays, state buildings, and so on. And so it kind of taps into this kind of cartographic legacy of representing Portugal's role in the Atlantic world in a very I don't think it's unconscious. I think it's on purpose to do so. And again, this sense of kind of using the colonial legacy of the past to claim a place for Portugal in the future as a kind of tech innovator of space industries. So that's kind of I think it's very intentional that they do it, because it's meant to resonate with the public. And again, the European Space Agency speakers that I've seen universally, okay, well, maybe that's a big term because I've only seen about 4 of them, but all have made reference to European colonization of the New World as primarily as a great feat of daring and adventure, a great scientific revolution and ingenuity, a display of kind of scientific prowess, but also this kind of thing which boosted the world economy. You're like, fuck. It's hard to hear people say this, particularly when they have British accents, which in some of them do.
Does Portugal have any particular advantages, like versus, are there places in the world that are better for a launch site than
Yes.
another place, or better to go to space from that Portugal has an advantage?
Yeah, there's a word for that which I don't know, which I tried to remember it and I forgot to write it down. It's basically about how easy it is to get to space from the curvature of the Earth. So tropical places and then equatorial regions are much easier, and that's part of the reason, for example, why the European Space Agency uses the French territory in French Guiana in Latin America to have its launches, because it's an equatorial region. So you use less energy because the way the Earth's spinning and the shape of the Earth. So the Azores, which is these cluster of islands in the middle of the Atlantic, they're in the North Atlantic, but they're not very equatorial, but they've got a good, they're still kind of on that way compared to mainland Portugal. And so it's meant to be easier to launch there, but the other reason is because there's very few people there, so it produces vast amount of ecological damage, you need huge amounts of land, so you can't really have population density next to it. And so they talk here of the Azores being this strategic asset because they don't quite put it like this, but almost low population density, basically it can be damaged without harming people too much. I can't remember exactly how they put it in very technocratic language. And again, a lot of the launch sites that exist, not only in the US, but other sites, are places where there was very little population, or the existing population was moved off its land, whether it's South Africa, Australia, French Guiana, Russia, Central Asia, where either there's little population or very little valued population, the more common aspect. So in the Azores, the idea is there's very few people live there. There's islands they can build this on not with less ecological damage, but less ecological damage which will affect people and they'll complain about it, or less people have to be displaced from their land and paid off and so on. But I hasten to add, I don't know. The Azores government is in favour of exploring this, doing feasibility reports. I don't know if the people are oppose this or not. I tried to find out and I couldn't. I don't have any contacts there, so I'd like to find what's happening about this there, what maybe there's activist groups opposing it, as there is with the deep sea mining.
What are the mining materials that they're talking about?
Well, they're rare earth minerals.
Rare non-earth mineral? No, I mean
No, rare
the space mining.
Yeah, sorry. With space
when
mining.
they're pitching the investments towards space
Yeah,
mining, are they also giving explanation about what specific minerals?
Yeah, they do. There's disagreement amongst scientists working on the content of asteroids, but they use they can test what they're made of using kind of I don't really know how it works, but tracking the fluctuations of light around these asteroids, and then they can sense that the different metals they're made of. I don't know how that works with spectrometry and so on, but they can also tell that they're often full of ice water, which burns off into you see comets and so on. And so there's this bit of tension between this, because they say, space mining advocates, companies and civil society actors and so on, they say that they're full of rare earth minerals like whatever, titanium or gold. And that was a big thing recently that all the gold on, so it's not that there's rare earth minerals and then there's rare non-earth minerals. The idea is that the stuff that's in the cosmos, or in our solar system, I should say at least, is all of the same stuff. It'll be different clusters of it, and that various processes through which the planets were made and so on meant that there was lower densities of things like gold than there is in cadmium, another one, lithium in the asteroids, which are more pure, like they're basically chunks of lithium, chunks of gold, and so on. and also ice. So the tension comes when people say, well, we're going to get all these minerals, then what are you going to do with it? Are you going to bring it back to Earth? The expense of trying to develop the technology is going to do that. The time frames involved. You know, you read Financial Times reports and they're saying, well, actually, it would collapse the economy of rare earth minerals if we could suddenly have access to all these. They say that on one asteroid, small asteroid the size of, I don't know, whatever, New York or whatever, will have more precious metals on it than the entirety of the Earth, because it'll be purely made of that. And it would collapse the economy. So some people are saying, well, you shouldn't actually do it. You should keep scarcity, which all seems to me quite like a fanciful scenario, because it seems like it's not going to happen anyway. But then others, who are these kind of space colonization advocates, say that the real purpose is not really to get the metal initially, it's to get water, because out of water you can make hydrogen, which will be used to fuel the kind of the more energy efficient jets for deep space exploration. So actually, the purpose is not to bring back metal resources to Earth, but to use water to get further into space. And then maybe the metals get used to I don't know, 3D print houses or whatever it is on moon colonies. I mean, these are quite serious debates that go on, and a lot of Earth, like a lot of geologists who then specialize in kind of in asteroid geology and so on are involved in these debates. And again, there's this kind of relationship between the earth sciences and extraction, which is kind of my field. Usually share an office with someone who's involved in some extractive industry of some sort. You know, this has been a very long tradition also, but now the kind of the technologies being used to monitor these things are very advanced. And so the European Space Agency did a Rosetta mission, which was amazing. I couldn't help but like it. When they sent a few years ago a probe, which would land on an asteroid going incredibly fast. I think it's the Europa asteroid, whatever. And so they landed that. They didn't do anything when they got there. The next part of the mission is to send another one, do that again, and then extract something and send it back to Earth. NASA is also doing a mission which will land and return in 2020. Maybe it's even before maybe even this year. They'll land on the moon, extract something, and bring it back in 3 years or whatever to Earth from the moon. So basically, you have the states investing in research and development, huge amounts of public taxpayers' money being invested in state developing technologies, which then can be released onto the market and commercialized for commercial extraction. And the European Space Agency has a very good aspect about it, that all its research and data is made public for everyone to use, not just Europeans, but everyone in the world. So their space mining technology will be available. They'll say how everything works, all the engineering codes and everything, when they do it. So it allows people to basically, anyone who has the money to invest, to use the European Space Agency mining technology when they develop it.
I'm just curious, like, are there statistics about like how much money gets spent on things like extraction and outer space commodities versus like human beings being able to be in space and withstand high levels of radiation and things like that? Like, is more money being spent on taking possible precious metals back to Earth versus like being able to actually sustain a human being in space?
I don't know, to be honest, about the statistics for either and how they'd be compared, but I'm sure people are collecting that data. But I mean, there has been a shift since the end of what's referred to as the kind of post-Apollo era, not just in the US, but around the world, of kind of the end of ambitious manned missions into outer space, so sending astronauts. What there's been since the 90s has been the International Space Station, where scientists go and they collaborate on scientific experiments. It's massively expensive. A lot of the tests they do are to test, say, how plants can they grow in space, what happens to their diets. They do different diets. They're continuously testing themselves. What happens to the human body, like bone density, changes to DNA, loss of sight, loss of memory, all these type of things. So they're kind of, those astronauts that mostly go to the International Space Station are now involved in conducting engineering feats like fixing the station and monitoring the effects of being in space for periods of time, including psychologically on themselves. So that's the kind of investment that goes into developing manned spaceflight, where most of the resources have gone towards on unmanned technologies, many of which have not come to fruition yet, developing these things like space grabbers for asteroids and so on. And, many of the things that the NASA's programs that were like Cassini and all these things, the telescope programs, are quite amazing in what they do. Those were launched in the 1970s or 80s, and they were much very expensive at the time. But in terms of the amount of data that's got back from them and how they were useful for science, was seen to be a very good investment compared to like sending astronauts to the moon or whatever, which is massively expensive. And but I don't really know. Sorry.
Have you compared sort of how many private enterprise projects there are versus how many government space projects there are? Like for Mars missions, you've got United Arab Emirates, China, India, Russia, NASA all have Mars missions, right? But also SpaceX has a Mars mission. Have you compared how many, kind of public entities versus private entities are involved in each?
I haven't. I mean, I think at this point the private entities vastly outnumber the nation state and the public entities, but most of the private entities are very small startup companies involved, as I said, in these nano satellites, or using not just satellite infrastructure, but involved in Earth observation data, like data management and collating and selling and all those type of things. So that vastly outnumbers in terms of numbers national space programs, but their influence and their effect and their funding is like minuscule in contrast. But I mean, I'm not really so much interested in, or my research is not so much interested in kind of building up data sets of statistics of like, here we can compare this and that. I'm more interested in kind of the specific states and what they're doing, and looking also at the Portuguese and Luxembourg cases as what's happening in there and how we might try and understand that and how it fits into broader trends. But yeah, I hope someone else does those types of statistics, so I can quote it at some point, but I'm not really interested in doing that. I'm not really a political scientist in that sense. I'm, I don't know, more of a theorist or whatever, So data plays a supporting role in my methods.
Well, that was really great. Thank you, Rory. Thank you all.
Thank you.